any other superbugs that we consider today that don't respond to antibiotics, and because of the fact that we aren't able to develop antibiotics that are resistant to it quick enough, we're probably going to have a lot of these superbugs taking over and could be used for biowarfare potentially. So the history of biowarfare, it was used as early as 600 BC, and these agents are found naturally, which makes them quite interesting, and why they've been used for so long is that they don't necessarily require any technology. You can find them naturally within society. And the way that they're generally used is that you can actually use infected animal carcasses and cadavers to use them as weapons. So in 1346, Tartars, this group of individuals, threw cadavers of infected soldiers into the city they were trying to take over just to weaken their opponents. And it works because these diseases and these bacteria can be spread so easily that if you just throw a cadaver in there, you can actually infect a whole bunch of different people. They've also used, biowarfare has been used in terms of contaminating water supplies. So this was done in the Civil War, where they actually just contaminated a lot of the water supply to really hurt a lot of individuals in the South. So it's been used in World War I, World War II, the Persian Gulf War, and the American Civil War. In World War I and World War II, it was used by countries like Germany and France and Japan, where they used a lot of anthrax and the plague to sort of infect a lot of their opponents. So what makes biowarfare so unique? It's invisible, you can't necessarily see it. There's delayed detection because it's hard for doctors and healthcare professionals to figure out exactly what's happening. So we saw that even with anthrax, it took a little while before they actually realized that it was anthrax, and by then the person had already died. So there's calls for an impaired response because generally speaking, when you have biowarfare, a lot of doctors are the ones who have to respond to this because the military doesn't necessarily know how to respond to these attacks. So because of this, you have a delayed response, but because you have a delayed response, a lot of people end up dying before you can actually figure out what's going on. There's a lack of cure for most of these diseases, like anthrax, there's no cure right now, and we don't necessarily know if we're going to have one in the future, but until then, there's this period where it could potentially be used and would cause mass destruction. And the interesting thing about biowarfare is that it has a huge psychological impact. So for example, when you see the anthrax letters, they didn't actually kill a lot of people, but the entire country got really scared and nervous, and people start to panic about what's going to happen next, and they become very fearful of their political structures and also the fact that they might die. So it creates this huge psychological impact that can essentially destroy countries' economic and political systems that they have and cause massive chaos within a country, more so than, for example, military robots or cyber warfare, where people trust that individuals know how to respond to it. With biowarfare, people tend to become really nervous about the reaction and are unsure and uncertain that governments will be able to respond. And as well, there's a globalization effect. So for example, if you take a flight from here to, let's say, like Africa, somewhere in Africa, you can literally spread that disease so quickly if you have it. So it makes it very unique in the sense that you could have someone being like sent over from a different country, a different area of the world to another, and have infect a lot of people in the other region. So it'd be really problematic in that sense. So there has been some regulation because countries do realize that it is possibly the most intense and scariest version of warfare that might emerge. So there's a Biological Weapons Convention signed in 1972 to limit the production of biological warfare and weapons, to have it be only for safety purposes and so that countries wouldn't be stockpiling it. The USA actually terminated its offensive biological weapons program under Ronald Reagan as well, so they stopped researching and stuff. But the thing is that research is still occurring despite these restrictions. So even though they've been made, a lot of countries are still researching and trying to figure out more about it. So it kind of shows the inadequacy of a lot of the regulations that we already have today, and it shows the need for having to have better, restrictions and regulations within our society. So let's just take a look at some of the actors who will be involved. Predominantly, I'm going to be focusing on the role of doctors and the role of the international community. So the role of doctors is going to be two-pronged, predominantly for biological warfare and military robots. So in terms of biological warfare, doctors were going to have to develop methods for early detection to make sure that they can actually catch these diseases or these bacteria when they spread early on, so they can actually respond to them. They're also going to be involved in surveillance and identifying bacteria that could be used in war efforts. So for example, if they see this huge superbug emerging, they're going to have to notify governments and other actors of the fact that this might potentially be used and that they should be very cautious of this. And of course, they're going to have to be involved in the treatment and remedies for these warfare technologies when they're used, and also provide guidance to the international community on how they should respond. And then secondly, military robots. So essentially, a lot of doctors might potentially have to artificially enhance human abilities. So yes, you might have a military robot that's entirely robotic, but you could also have like a cyborg where you have a human soldier that has a bunch of like additional capacities, so they're better at making moral judgments, they're stronger, things like that. So doctors might be involved in having to artificially enhance these abilities, which will mirror more genetic engineering, which is different from what they're used to. It's a more proactive approach, so to speak, because they're going to be involved in helping these soldiers beforehand rather than helping them after the fact when they get injured. But this might raise ethical dilemmas for a lot of doctors who might not support this and may not want to be involved in this sort of genetic modification. Secondly, let's take a look at the role of the international community. So the role of the international community is going to be very, very broad. They're going to have a lot of things that they're going to have to take a look at. Predominantly, they're going to have to ensure that they have accessible distribution. So like I mentioned before, with the advancement of any technology, there's going to be that initial gap where some countries get it and some don't. The international community is going to have to step in to regulate how this is distributed, how much countries get, and whether or not some countries should actually just be prevented from having it or not. It's possible that this might create greater divides within society because there will be this initial gap, but through proper regulation, you'll still have winners and losers, but you can ensure that you don't have a huge discrepancy between the two, that people are still able to survive and be prosperous. So there's going to be 3 key humanitarian principles that will take part in this. So proportionality, so making sure that whatever technologies emerge are more beneficial than they are destructive. Distinction, which is basically that you need to minimize the collateral damage when you use these technologies. And finally, military necessity, so these technologies should only be used when they're militarily necessary. They shouldn't just be used all the time or just for fun. It should only be used in the more dire circumstances. So you're also going to probably see there being more stringent treaties and regulatory bodies that exist to ensure that research and development don't necessarily go out of hand, to make sure that things are still done ethically and that you aren't having huge harm to individuals. There's also going to be hard and soft governance, so this involves hard governance, which is laws and regulations, whereas soft governance is more so looking at lab standards and things like that. So the international community is going to have to take both of those approaches when you have a lot of these technologies emerging. And the biggest thing is that they need to cooperate. So you can't necessarily have these international actors going at each other's throats and being really, really divisive in terms of their opinions. They need to cooperate to ensure that it's done in a safe manner and that you can actually have more benefits for individuals rather than harms. So they will need to cooperate, and it's going to require a lot more work on the part of these organizations that tend to be stagnant in terms of when they make decisions. They're going to have to be a lot quicker and rapid and a lot more willing to negotiate. So that's what I have for my presentation, but I do have a couple of questions for you guys, and then I'll open up the floor if you guys have any questions for me. So some of my questions. So the first one, what technology do you think poses the greatest risk to humanity in the future? Yeah.
Honestly, the soldier robots, I can't see how that could create less deaths, because even if it's proportional on both sides, like in the video you showed us, they're just shooting at targets, but what happens when those targets are actually people? And I can't see how a country would want to distribute robots evenly, because then the robots would just be killing each other, then who wins?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. It's really tough to say because we haven't necessarily seen a future where that might be the case. But I think like with military robots, there is that sort of idea that yes, they could be shooting at humans and those targets as well. But at the same time, you do kind of prevent a lot of those unnecessary deaths that occur. So you can prevent a lot of civilians from dying, where it's only maybe like soldiers and things like that, or infrastructure, rather than having civilians die, because we see that right now. There's a lot of civilians who die in the line of combat when they never should have been the ones dying in the first place. So I think that's potentially why or where you can see a little bit less of that death occurring and a little bit less of those byproducts of war. But it is definitely something to consider, and it is quite scary. But yeah, thanks for help.
Just to kind of add on to that, the thing with having military robots though is that right now, if a country is considering war, it's not just necessarily about the other side, right? They have to consider that their own soldiers there's going to be deaths on their own side. So when it comes down to I'm not worried that my soldiers are going to die because I have these military robots, but I don't really care about the other side. We could see situations of like occupation where you're sending military robots to people, right? So in that sense, it's worse it's making like the powerful more powerful and the less less powerful. So I would see that as a big problem.
No, for sure, that's totally true. Yes.
I also think, just expanding on what you guys said, I think robotic things would work best if they're going against people. Because if you have robots versus robots, it kind of becomes more of a money game. Who has more money? Who can send more robots out to be the other person? And if they get destroyed, who can make more faster, right, with more money? So I feel like it only works efficiently if it's against people, which again brings back the whole ethical point, right? You're sending it to kill people.
Yeah.
But once you have robots coming back, then it's kind of just how much money are you willing to spend, and will that cripple your economy? Will it cripple the other person's economy, right? And so forth. So I still think that would be a pretty bad.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think with military robots as well, you see that money game sort of where it's more about destroying a country's economy and a lot of their social structures that exist rather than trying to just kill a lot of their people. So that does become a huge problem for sure. Yes.
So while it is ideal maybe that you have robots fighting against other robots, what if you have instances of civil discourse within its own country? Do you have the government sending out these robots to kill their own people in this case? And what if these robots what if the people, even if they unite, just can't overtake these robots? And what if this government is just tyrannical, for example, right? And so what if you just have no peace essentially in some nations just because they have the ability to just suppress their own people?
Yeah.
So I think that might be another humanitarian thing to consider.
Yeah, for sure. Those are really good. So how do you think the international community should respond to these advancements? Yes.
I don't know an exact response, but I think a lot of, depending on the country, they have to think about, for example, let's talk about the states. They have a constitution where they say they have the right to bear arms against the government in case the government tries to or if in case they want to overthrow the government. So in that type of scenario, I think that all the other countries in general and countries that have a constitution similar to that have to kind of realize that if a government has that, like Mark was saying, sometimes the people that they're governing wouldn't have the power to overthrow the government if they needed to, right?
Yeah.
For some crazy situation. But so it kind of comes back to what he was saying and how other countries would even play a part because, for example, if the States or China or Russia ends up having supremacy over these quantum robots, or sorry, not quantum robots, the robots, you wouldn't know exactly what to do because they wouldn't be able to fight them in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's definitely really good. Yes.
Just another thing to add, at the international level, when it comes down to having these military robots, it's gonna be chaos unless there's some type of international communication. And I don't know if this is something that maybe the United Nations would deal with or something like that, but it's definitely not going to be practical if the rich countries or the more powerful countries are just kind of in their own league. And it kind of it's all building up on top of each other, but there has to be some kind of set of rules or set of something.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of those military treaties and perhaps a bigger regulatory body that's separate from NATO or the United Nations. You might need a organization that simply just focuses on war and these technological measures that will be used to kind of mitigate a lot of these harms that do result and are quite lengthy. For example, that rich and gap. The rich and poor gap is definitely a big one, and it's really important that the international community is involved in ensuring that it doesn't get out of hand. And then finally, I guess you guys touched on this quite a bit already, but do you have any specific fears for the future of war, or what do you think is going to happen? Yeah.
So I think biowarfare is the scariest one on the list because that can't be contained and you can't form any kind of legislation or committee to control it and regulate it. Because once a disease or something gets out, its virulence factor and its pathogenicity is something we can't control, and it could kill millions we've seen in the past through the plague, the Black Death, all that.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was kind of going to say the same thing, but I know in your presentation you made a point about it's difficult to control research of these things, and that I think that's true because people are going to research these biological organisms, I guess, not all of them, but yeah, regardless, because not just for the purpose of biological warfare. And so I think the reason why it's the scariest might be because it's the most realistic in our current life, I guess, because it wouldn't be too far-fetched to see something like that happen today.
Yeah, for sure, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
I think another fear that people should have is that the whole like robots going to war against each other, people going to war against each other, that's just assuming that two countries are still playing so basically they know they're going to war, right? And they come to one spot and they fight each other in one spot, right? And
Yeah.
then they either win or lose, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't take into consideration if one country chooses to bypass the whole thing and just target someone's civilians.
Yeah.
Right? So if someone uses robots to target someone's civilians instead of their army, right?
Yeah.
So I think that should be a big fear too, not just for robots, but for biological warfare as well. You're not targeting the actual army anymore, but you're targeting like the foundation of the economy and the social structure and everything.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely one of the biggest reasons why it's so problematic. So I think it's really good, guys. Do you have any questions for me? Yeah.
So since using robots for warfare is a very real possibility, and it's very likely that the more rich and powerful countries will be able to get these resources first. If there was ever a possibility that two large powerful nations were ever to fight, and let's say one was just beating out the other, do you think the idea of deterrence using nuclear warfare would be eliminated and one country would just kind of just like, break that deterrence because they're already losing out?
I think it's possible, but I think at the same time that's kind of where the international community has to step in and where you need to have some sort of regulation to prevent things like nuclear warfare from being used. I think there definitely has to be those guidelines to constrain those countries, because you don't just want, like, for example, the United States and China just going at each other and both of them like suffering, because the thing is it's not just those countries, you have all these civilians who are going to suffer economically and socially within those countries that are pretty much crippling. I think it has these huge global effects within the world as well that are different from just warfare. So I think that's where the international community has to step in and be like, okay, this is too much because our economic structures are failing, our entire economy, everything within the world is falling apart. And I think those repercussions and those byproducts are far more detrimental than any of those two countries just kind of fighting each other. So I think it's possible that you might have nuclear warfare kind of come up as okay, we'll just use this because we're failing anyways. But I think there needs to be some sort of regulation to prevent that. Yeah.
I think another problem, Ryan, I just want to see your take on it.
Yeah.
What if you have two countries, and when you have two armies fighting against each other, just like we have now, right, on foot and everything, people know of how many people are lost, right?
Yeah.
And it's there's a lot of media coverage on it,
Yeah.
and people know if we're losing, and then there's kind of a push on the government to say, hey, we should step back, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't be losing this many soldiers. But when it comes to robots and everything, and they're fighting each other and you're losing, there's economic losses and not necessarily man-made losses. How do you think, what if the government is able to kind of downplay those losses and kind of cripple the economy without killing anyone, right? And wouldn't that be a worst case scenario for the country than if they lost people but they didn't go into a recession because of it?
Yeah. I think the thing is then it comes to the idea that you have to hope that voters and citizens within those countries are knowledgeable enough to actually stand up and be like, okay, this is too much. We're investing all of our resources into this war. And yes, people aren't dying, which is great, but our economy is collapsing as a result of this. I think it's kind of that trust within those citizens that they have to sort of rise up and recognize that and be cognizant of it. But I do think, yes, it is a worse harm in that sense that you kind of cripple a country's economy just by trying to win a war, since there isn't necessarily as clear of a loser or winner, which is generally what countries want to have. So I think it's definitely going to be, in part, the citizens of those countries, but also regulations and making sure that there's sort of that limit that's placed on those individuals in those countries.
Just one last thing.
Yeah.
Something else with this idea of say we have robot on robot combat, right? With war, usually there's some type of goal, whether it's power, whether it's land, whether it's something. But when you have just robots, I don't know, I can't see the end to the war if these robots are really both sides powerful, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, when do they call it quits? When does one side go okay, this is enough? Is it when they lose robots and then there's a threat of losing people because the robots are all gone, or I don't know.
I think it becomes partially that, and then partially just when it becomes unsustainable. So for example, the United States and Canada and every country invest a certain amount into their military and their defense. So with lives, you can sort of gauge how much you're losing with weapons and stuff. You can also gauge that as well. So I think when a country starts to deem that it's unsustainable for them, and they simply can't win that war, I think as well right now the wars that we generally see are pretty much isolated. It's not really huge world wars. It's more smaller wars that tend to exist between countries. I think it will be something that's going to be tough to determine when they stop, but in my head I think it would predominantly come from when those countries believe that it's unsustainable for them to continue in that war, which is kind of what happens already under status quo, is that a lot of countries pull out when they realize they're losing too much. So maybe they're not losing lives as much, but they're losing robots and they're losing a lot of economic power that they have, or are investing too many resources into it and they can't really keep that up. I think that's kind of when you'd see that. But yeah, thank you guys so much for that. I hope